Welcome back. Let's now try out Flexbox for the very first time in practice. And for now we're going to use CodePen again, because what we want right now is just to write a simple demo, so a simple example. And for that, CodePen is perfect. So just head over to codepen.io and then click here, create a new pen. Okay, so we can hide this JavaScript part here, and then just HTML and CSS. So here in the HTML, let's just create a container with a couple of items in it. And we can actually use the emmet syntax here that I showed you before. So an element called container, and then with items in there. So class item, and then 5 times, hit tab, and that's it. And I'm just going to put some numbers here, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And that should be enough for our demo. Now, before writing any actual Flexbox code, let's start by doing our global reset like we usually do. So margin 0, padding 0, and box sizing border box. Okay, now we can hit save here as well. And no, we don't need an account, so let's remove that as well. Okay, and now just some very quick formatting for the container and for the items. So just a quick background color, like this gray color, and give it some padding as well of like 10 pixels. Okay, so no Flexbox code here at all, just some initial styling before we start with Flexbox. Now about the items, let's give them some background color as well. And I'm using this pink color, which is F1425D. Okay. Then some padding, let's say 40 pixels. Some margin as well, like 30 pixels. A white text color. And a bigger text as well. So font size, let's say 40 pixels as well. Okay. Maybe this is a bit too much, 30. But okay, so now we're good to go. So in this lecture, what I want to do is to focus on the Flexbox properties that we apply on a container. Okay, so basically the first set of properties that I showed you in the last lecture. So the first thing we have to do in order to use Flexbox, remember, is to set the display property to flex. And take a look at what happens immediately. Okay, so these flex items here, they're now automatically side by side, right? Without using any float, without anything, all we did was to set the container to flex, then automatically these child elements become flex items that are displayed side by side. All right, now the next thing that I want to show you is the property called flex direction. So remember that the default, so the initial value, is the row. So if we say row, nothing changes, right? Because that's the default. But we can also say row reverse. And what happens then is that it inverts the direction of the main axis. So the main axis now goes here from the right side to the left side, where before it was going from the left side to the right side, as I showed you in the diagram in the last lecture, right? And so with this, we inverted the order. And so of course it now starts at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right? Now the next thing that we can try out is the column. And then we get this result. And so now the flex items are stacked one on top of another. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down here. And then the last one is column reverse. And you can imagine what that one will do. Exactly. Now basically the column starts down here, which means that the main direction is going from here down here, up in the direction up here. Okay? So remember, it's always important to know where the main direction goes. Okay? And now that we experimented with all of these, let's just set it back to row, which is the default. So you can probably imagine that this will be pretty handy, for example, for responsive designs. That, for example, on a smaller screen, we can simply set the flex direction to column, and then the elements will all be one on top of another. So that is flex direction. Next up, I want to show you justify content. So justify content. And remember that this property is used to control how the items should be positioned along the main axis, right? So let's start with center here. And so you see that automatically all the items are now right here in the center of the container. So with that very simple property, we immediately centered the entire content in this container. Just imagine how difficult it would be to create this very simple layout that you see here with a float layout. It would be much harder. So center puts these items here right in the middle of the container, but doesn't do anything to the space that's between them, right? Because the space that we have here is defined by the margin that we have on the items, right? So this margin here defines the space. Let's actually try to remove it. Okay, and then it would look like this, right? So all that justify content does is to put all the items in the center of the Flex container, okay? So let me show you another one here, which is space between. And that one is also very exciting. Space between, and that's the result. So what you see now is that the space is evenly distributed between these Flex items. So this space and this, and this, it's all the same space. And Flexbox automatically does all these calculations for us and automatically positions the elements like this. And of course, if we change the width here of the browser, then the space that's between these items also adjusts, right? So that makes it really easy to position and align these elements. Now let me once again get rid of that margin here. Okay, because now that makes it even more visible what the space between property here does. Because there's another one which is actually pretty similar, which is called space around. Space around. So basically what space around does here is that it puts the same amount of space on both the left side and the right side of each of the Flex items. So what this means is that this total space between these two Flex items is double the space that's here on this left side of this item. All right. Now next up, there's space evenly, which is also pretty similar to these ones. So space evenly. And as you can see, what this one does is that the space is always the same. So this one is the same as this and this and this and all of the spaces here between them. Okay, so while space evenly ensures that the space is always the same between the elements and on the sides of the elements, space around ensures that the amount of space around each element is the same on the left and on the right side, okay? So it's a subtle difference, but it can make a huge difference sometimes. Okay, so space between, space around, and space evenly. I also showed you center already, and so now what we have left is Flex end. So when we want them on the right side, okay, and then Flex start, which is the default. So these are the options for justify content. And I will leave it at center here, okay? And I will also get rid of this margin. All right, and now the last property I want to show you in this video is align items. So remember that justify content defines how the Flex items are aligned along the main axis, and align items here defines how the items are aligned along the cross axis. Okay? Now in order for this to work, we actually need one of them to be bigger than all the others, because right now they are already perfectly aligned along the cross axis, right? So along this one here. But if I make one of them bigger than the others, then we can experiment with different alignments across the cross axis, right? So let me just put a new class here. So I2 for item 2. And let's give it some height, like 200 pixels or something. And all right, so you saw already that all of them actually growed, not just the I2 on which we defined the height, right? And that's actually because the initial value on align items is stretch. And so with stretch, this is what happens. So let's just set something else here. So for example, center. And now we see what alignment along the cross axis actually means. Okay, so we have one element that is bigger than all the others, and with align items set to center, we basically center these elements here relative to this one, which is bigger, in the vertical direction, so in the cross axis, right? So now along the cross axis, they are now all nicely centered, like around this line here, right? Now if we set this to Flex start, then they will all be aligned here nicely at the top, okay? And the same for Flex end, then they will be aligned here to the end. And all of that happens once again along the cross axis, so in here, from up to down. So we saw center, flex start, flex end, and of course the default is stretch. So what does stretch do? Well, as you see, it simply stretches all the other elements to match the height of the highest flex item, okay? So that can be very useful as well. Now there's actually one more, which is called baseline, and for that I'm going to increase the font size on this one here as well. Or actually I can do it on another one. Let's add one class here called I4. And then in here as well. So font size 70 pixels. Okay, and now if I set this one here to baseline, then what it will do is to basically align the text on these flex items along a line. So if you draw an imaginary line here under these texts, you will see that they are now completely aligned. And if I increase this even more, like say to 90, then they all keep nicely aligned down here along the text, okay? So basically, align items to baseline is to align them to their common text, okay? Now once again, I'm going with center here, and of course, I don't want this font size. Okay, so these were the three properties that I wanted to show you in this video here. So flex direction, justify content, and align items. Because these three are by far the most used Flexbox properties on the Flex container. Now there are also flex wrap and align content, but I'm gonna leave these for another video. Now, before we finish this one, I want to show you what happens with the justify content and align items when we change the flex direction. Okay, so let's set this one to a column. All right, and now the main direction is no longer going from the left to the right, but from the top to the bottom, right? And so why are these items now here horizontally centered like this? Do you know why? Well, it's because of this align items property set to center, right? Because this direction here now, so basically the horizontal centering is now in the cross direction. And remember that align items is the property that controls the positioning along the cross axis. And so this center here is responsible for that. So let's set it to flex start. And so now we see that it's at the beginning of the cross axis, which remember now goes from left to right. So it starts here and it ends here. And so if we set it to flex end, then all of these move to the right side, right? And so once again, it's really important to keep track of where the main and the cross axis are situated in order to use the justify content and align items properties in the correct way. Okay? And now just to show you how the justify content works in this situation, let's just increase the height of this container. Okay? To, I don't know, like me experiment here a bit, 500 pixels, for example. No, that's not enough. So 1000 pixels even. Or maybe it should be even more, I guess. So 1500 pixels. Okay, and now let's see what happens here. And so you see that they now start here, and then they're basically centered now in the container, right? So this space here, down here at the end of the container, is the same as this space here up here, right? And once again, why is that? Well, it's because justify content is set to center. And so along the main axis, which is now going from top to the bottom, right? So along this main axis, they are now centered. So let's change it to space between. And so this is what happens. So the space is now distributed here between these items, just as I showed you before. But when I showed it to you the first time, it was horizontally. So it was in this direction, but now as we change it to a column, it now happens in the vertical direction. Because once again, that is now the main axis. All right, and I think that was enough experimentation for one lecture alone. And I know that it's probably very confusing right now, because I felt the exact same thing when I first started learning Flexbox. It was all very confusing in my head and so many properties with so many different names. But believe me that after some time using these, you will really know how to use them and when to use which property, and it will all become really easy for you, okay? So don't worry if it sounds confusing right now, because with practice, it becomes really easy and intuitive, okay? And in the next lecture, we're going to take care of the properties related to the flex items themselves, okay? So we're going to change some order, and experiment with the flex grow, shrink, and flex basis properties. Okay, so keep tuned for that next lecture. After the Flexbox properties for the Flex container, now I want to show you the properties that we use directly on the Flex items. So this is where we left off after the last lecture. Now let me just put this one here so it aligns item back to center. Okay, because now the first thing that I want to show you is the align self property. Okay, so we can come here to one of these items and then use align self. And remember what align self does? Well, basically it overrides the align contents property for one individual item. So right now the align items is set to center, okay? And so all these items here are now centered along the cross axis, right? So from top to bottom. But if we want to override that for one individual, let's say the number 4 here, we can say align self and put this one, for example, at the end. So flex end. And so now all the flex item except this one here are aligned to the center, so along the cross axis here, except for this one, which we set to flex end. And we can set it to flex start, of course. We can also set it to stretch, and that one is pretty useful. And we're going to see that one in the course. And so now this one is actually the same height as this one, because it's stretched in order to fill the entire container, which was defined by this element with the number 2. And so now the number 4 here has the same height. Okay, so let's just put it back to the end here. So flex end. All right, so that's the first one that I want to show you. And next we can play around with the order. So remember that the initial value of order is 0. And so if you want to put one of these elements here at the beginning, all we need to do is to put a value which is lower than 0. So let me show you how. So order -1. And now it will go here to the start. And so why is that? Well, Flexbox orders all of these elements according to their order number. And so this one has 0, 0, 0, and 0. So all of these have 0, but this one has -1. And so this is the one that has the lowest order. And since Flexbox starts ordering from the lowest order number, well, then of course this one here becomes the first, right? Now if you want to change this, and let's put another class here for the third one. So I3, if you want this one here to be the first one, then we can set this order to -2, for example. And now this one will be the one with the lowest order. And so it now comes here to the first position. Now we can also do this the other way around. So if we set this one to 1, then it's the one with the highest order. And so it moves here to the end. And so now we have -1, 0, 0, 0, 1. And we can use this even further if you wanted. So for example here order 2, and now this one would be the last, right? So that's how we use order. And that's actually pretty useful once more for responsive design in order to change position for some elements on a smaller or on a bigger screen, depending if we're using a mobile first or a desktop first strategy. All right, so that's order and align self. Now let's take a look at the last 3, which are flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. So the first one that I want to show you is flex grow. And remember that flex grow is the ability of an element to grow. Okay, and what we do is to specify an integer. So just a number like we did in the order. So the first thing I want to do is to actually set flex on all the items, right? And so for that I can use here the item class. So flex grow 1, and take a look what happens now. All right, so all of them now occupy the entire space that they can. Or in other words, they grow as much as they can. So they're now occupying all the space they possibly can, right? And we can see that even better if we remove this margin here actually. Okay, and so now they're actually touching one another because again, they occupy all the space that they can. And that's what flex grow here does. Okay, so it gives items the ability to grow. Now if we set all of them to a higher number like 2 or 3, or even 23, it doesn't really matter because this number only matters in relation to other numbers. So let me actually give you an example of that. Okay, so I'm gonna set these back to 1, put this margin here back as well. But now what I'm gonna do with this one here is to set flex grow to 2. And watch what happens now. You saw that? This element here is now double the size of these ones. And that's because 2 is double of 1. And so this one has twice the ability to grow than all the other flex items. And I can show you that even better by setting this, for example, to 3. And now it's 3 times bigger than the others. So flex grow, again, gives the element an ability to grow. Now remember that there's also a shorthand property which stands for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. And so saying flex grow is actually the same thing as saying flex 1, okay? So a simple trick to expand a flex item to occupy as much width as it can is simply setting its flex property to 1, okay? Let me get rid of this now. And this one here as well. So let me show you what happens if I just set this on one of them. Let's say this one here, the last one. So flex 1. All right, and so now this one occupies all the space that it can, so all the available white space, and then the remaining flex items here, they just occupy the rest of the space. Okay, so that is flex grow. Now next up, I want to show you flex basis. Let's do it on this one here. Actually, and I can actually get rid of this one here. So flex basis, and now remember that with this one, we can set the width of a flex item. Okay, so instead of using the width property on a flex item, we usually use flex basis, right? So let's set it to 20%, for example, and here we go. So it's now 20% of the container, then these other elements here, which basically have their flex basis set to auto, which is the initial value for flex basis, okay? So this one here simply occupy the space that they need, and then all the remaining space is occupied by this last element here, because it flex set to 1. Okay, and now the one that's missing is flex shrink, okay? And in order to better show that to you, let's actually change this one here to a pixel-based value, okay? So let's say 300 pixels. Okay, and so now this one here has 300 pixels. Now take a look at what happens when I decrease the viewport width, okay? So just decreasing this window here. So you saw what happens? So again, the first thing, of course, that happens is that this element here grows smaller and smaller. That's because it has less and less space which it can occupy, and so of course it becomes smaller, right? Now, as I further decrease this here, what starts to happen now? Well, you see that this element here also decreases, right? So even if we set its flex basis to 300 pixels, so basically we set the width to 300 pixels, it still starts decreasing when there's no more available space, okay? But sometimes that's not exactly what we want, okay? So we can actually change that using the flex shrink property, because remember, flex shrink controls how an element can shrink. So flex shrink. Now remember that flex shrink has the initial value of 1, okay? And so 1 means that the element is basically allowed to shrink, okay? And that's why we see this behavior here, where the element starts getting smaller and smaller as there's no more available space. Now, if we don't want this to happen, we simply set it to 0. And with that, the element is no longer allowed to shrink. So let's see that. And you see what happens now? These last elements simply get clipped, basically, from the viewport. Or actually, the viewport increases its width in order to fit these remaining elements. But what doesn't happen is that this element doesn't change its width, because it's not allowed to shrink, okay? And so that's what we did here with flex shrink to 0. All right? Now, as I mentioned before, we should always use the flex property, okay? And so instead of having this, we just use the shorthand, because that's the best practice. So flex, and now it's 0 for flex grow, right? Because we don't want this element to grow as much as it can, so occupying all the space it can. Then we also don't want it to shrink, and we want a flex basis of 300 pixels, for example. And so that's exactly the thing that we had before. Okay, let's convert this one here as well. Well, where is it? No, it's not here anymore. Okay, so I already deleted. But what we usually want here is actually the 1. So usually we want the elements to be able to shrink, right? because we don't want that situation where the elements no longer fit the container. Okay, and so that's the way it works now. And so with that, I showed you all of the properties that we can apply to a Flex item. Now there's a lot more to learn, of course, and again, we're going to use all of this later in the project. And by then, you can see how we actually use all of these properties in real-life situations. So this here is just a very small example, just to really show you how the properties work and that they exist. But as soon as we start the project, you will use these properties in the real life, and everything will make a lot more sense to you. Just before we finish this basic intro to Flexbox part, I want to quickly show you what happens when we have a whole lot of Flex items in a Flex container. So right now we have these 5 elements, but what happens if we just add another 5 of these? Okay, so let's get rid of these class names here, of course. And then 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Okay, so you see that all of these Flex items, they're now getting crammed here into this line. And if we decrease this even more, then there's even less and less space available. And at some point, they even start overflowing the Flex container like this, like we saw before actually. But as you know, there's another property that we can use on the Flex container, right? And that is called Flex wrap. So Flex wrap, and its initial value is no wrap. That's because it's not wrapping into a new line. But if we say wrap, like this, then it will create a new line for these Flex items that no longer fit the container. And so that's actually happening already. So you see that this item here with the 3, so this I3 here, which has this Flex set to 1, has now an entire new row for itself. And if we actually decrease this even more, then you see that more and more elements come down here to the second row, so basically the second line that is created here as the Flex items start to wrap. Okay? And once more, this can be pretty useful for responsive design when we get less and less space to work with in our layouts, right? Now let's again get rid of these huge margins that we have here. So I'm going to put 5 pixels here just so that we have a little bit of margin. And so that's what it looks like. Now, let me actually increase the container here, okay? So you see that right now the container ends here, of course, and that makes sense. But for what I want to show you next, we need a higher container. So let's increase it. Well, not that much, probably. So let's actually, like, I don't know, maybe 1000 pixels. And so let's see what it looks like this. So with all this space, this creates a bunch of different lines here. And actually, I'm not sure about this one here. Let's reload it. Or first save this actually, and then reload it. And it still does that. Okay, that looks a bit weird here. It looks like it should be in here. Let's check that one out. And yeah, of course, it is just because it's set here to Flex end here, okay? So that's the only reason why it's down here. It's actually on the same row as this one. So let's just change this one here, or simply get rid of it. So that's the same effect. So what happens here is that we have 2 rows, basically. So first this one, and then this one. Now, why is all of this space here between these rows? So this one and this one. Well, that's because of the align content property that I didn't show you yet. And so I'm going to show it to you right now. And that's one of these that's once again set here on the Flex container. So align content, and let's set it to Flex start. Okay, and so now all of these rows move up. Okay, and that is because what the align content property does is that it aligns the rows along the cross axis. So it's pretty similar to align items, with the difference that align items aligns the Flex items, as the name actually says, and align content aligns entire, let's say, rows along the cross axis, right? And so now, as we set Flex start here, both these rows are now here at the beginning, and then all of the space down here is empty, right? Now we can also set it to Flex end, just to demonstrate you that. And so both rows basically move down here, okay? Let me decrease this a bit here so that the last row doesn't have only this one element, okay? And so let's actually try another one here. So center. which is also pretty useful. And so now, as you can guess, the space here, up here, is the same as the one down here, because these two rows are now centered inside the Flex container along the cross axis. So basically vertically, right? Now this is a bit difficult to visualize here because we don't have a lot of space here, okay? We just increase this a little bit more, okay? Now there's also space around, just as we have in justify content. So it's the same logic. And this is what it looks like. So basically it distributes the space between the rows so that the space on the bottom and on top of each of the rows is the same. Okay, so just like with justify content. Then we also have space between, which will push one of the lines to the top of the element and the other one to the bottom. Okay, and then finally stretch, which is actually the default. So the initial value. Now the stretch here doesn't really stretch all of these elements like it does in align items, okay? It just stretches the rows, which is not really visible. So this is pretty similar to like space between, okay? So align content is the last property that I wanted to show you. And again, it controls how the rows are aligned along the cross axis, similar to align items. And that is actually it. So that's all I had to show you here in this very basic introduction about Flexbox. So now you know the very fundamentals of Flexbox so that you are ready to move on to the project that we're about to start in the next lecture. So, are you excited about that? Then don't wait and join me right in the next lecture. See you there.